We were rejected by 12,000 worlds, so we built something better. The chamber went silent the moment the final vote appeared on the board. I remember staring at the number, waiting for it to change, waiting for someone to tell me there had been a mistake. 12,000 worlds, 12,000 votes. Every single one against us. My name is Daniel Hart, and on that day I was standing behind our ambassador, Laura Bennett, in the great assembly hall of the Galactic Concord. I was not a diplomat. I was an engineer who had been sent along to answer technical questions about our ships, our reactors, our cities. I never expected to answer anything. I never expected the vote to fail so completely. The hall itself was built to make you feel small. It rose in rings of light, hundreds of species seated in curved balconies that stretched so high the ceiling disappeared into a haze of golden mist. Somewhere above us, a species called the Threll floated in transparent pods filled with pale blue gas. Below them sat the Corveni, tall and thin, their skin catching the light like polished glass. And below all of them, on the lowest ring, sat us. 7 humans, in a hall built for 12,000 worlds, waiting to hear if we belonged. I had studied the Concord's history for months before the trip. I knew their laws, their customs, the careful rituals that governed how a new species was welcomed into the wider galaxy. I believed, foolishly, that if we followed every rule, if we answered every question with patience and honesty, they would see what we saw in ourselves. A young species, yes, flawed, yes, but capable of more than they imagined. I was wrong. The first sign of trouble came during the questioning. A delegate from a world called Ostrene stood and asked why humanity had fought so many wars against itself before reaching the stars. Laura answered carefully, explaining our history, our slow and painful climb toward unity. She spoke of how every civilization carries scars from its past, and how ours had taught us the value of cooperation. The delegate did not sit down right away. He looked at the panel of judges seated at the center of the hall, and he said something that I still remember word for word. He said that a species, which had needed so long to stop fighting itself, could not be trusted to behave once it reached the stars. A murmur passed through the hall, rings of light flickering as different species reacted in their own way. Some clicked, some hummed, some simply went still. I felt my chest tighten, because I understood, in that moment, that the question was not really a question. It was a verdict already decided, dressed up to look like curiosity. More questions followed. A representative from the Vashtu cluster asked about our weapons programs. Another asked about our expansion plans, our birth rates, our appetite for resources. Every question circled back to the same fear, spoken in different words each time. They were afraid of us, not because of anything we had done to them, but because of what we might become. I watched Laura's hands, resting on the podium, and I saw her knuckles whiten as she gripped the edge. She never let it show in her voice. She answered every question with the same calm patience, even as the questions grew sharper, even as the tone in the hall shifted from curiosity to something closer to judgment. When the questioning ended, the judges retreated behind a wall of shifting light to deliberate. We were told this could take hours, sometimes days. We sat together on the lowest ring, 7 humans surrounded by the quiet weight of thousands of eyes watching us from above. I remember Marcus Webb, our systems specialist, leaning over and asking me quietly if I thought we had a chance. I told him I did not know. I wanted to believe we did. I wanted to believe that after everything humanity had built, after every sacrifice made just to reach this room, someone up there would see us clearly. The deliberation lasted 6 hours. When the light returned and the judges took their seats again, I felt a strange calm settle over me, the kind of calm that comes right before something breaks. The head judge, a being from a species I had never seen before, tall and covered in fine silver scales, rose to deliver the verdict. Her voice carried through the hall without any visible effort, amplified by some technology built into the architecture itself. She said that the Concorde recognized humanity's achievements. She said our science was impressive, our unity remarkable given our short history. And then she said the word that changed everything: rejected. She explained that the vote had been near unanimous. Of the 12,000 worlds represented in that hall, every single one had voted against our admission, not because we lacked technology, not because we lacked intelligence, but because, in her words, we were judged too unpredictable, too recently violent, too young to be trusted with the responsibilities that came with joining a galactic community. I did not move. I do not think any of us moved. I remember the sound of the hall around us, the low hum of thousands of beings shifting in their seats, some already turning away, already forgetting about the small delegation on the lowest ring. To them, this was simply another vote, another item on a long agenda. To us, it was the end of everything we had hoped to build. Laura stood there for a long moment before she spoke. When she did, her voice was steady, though I could hear the effort behind it. She thanked the judges for their time. She said humanity would take their decision under consideration and would not trouble the Concord further today. It was the most human thing I have ever seen her do, holding herself together in front of 12,000 worlds that had just told us we did not belong. We left the hall in silence. I remember walking down a long corridor of light, our footsteps echoing against walls that seemed to absorb every other sound. None of us spoke until we reached our shuttle, small and plain compared to the vessels docked around it, ships from 100 different worlds gleaming under starlight none of us had ever seen before that trip. Marcus was the first to break the silence. He asked what we were supposed to tell people back home. Laura did not answer right away. She sat down in her seat, closed her eyes, and let out a breath that seemed to carry the weight of everything she had been holding back inside that hall. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but certain. She said we would tell them the truth. That the door had been closed, that 12,000 worlds had looked at humanity and decided we did not belong among them. I asked her what we would do next. I expected her to say something about appeals, about future votes, about trying again in 10 years or 20, the way the Concord's own rules allowed. Instead, she looked out the shuttle window at the vast ring of worlds spread out before us, more nations gathered in one place than humanity had ever imagined possible, and she said something I have never forgotten. She said that if they would not open the door for us, then we would build one of our own. At the time, I thought it was simply something said in anger, the kind of thing anyone might say after being humiliated in front of an audience that large. I did not understand, not yet, how literally she meant it. The flight home took weeks. I spent most of it staring out at the stars, thinking about the silver-scaled judge and her calm, final word, rejected. I thought about the delegate who spoke of our wars as if they defined us forever, as if growth and change meant nothing once a mistake had been made. I thought about the thousands of eyes that watched us leave, already moving on to the next item on their agenda, the next species seeking a place among them. We were not the first species to be rejected. The Concord's records showed dozens of civilizations denied entry over the centuries. Most of them faded from galactic memory soon after, either destroyed by conflicts of their own making or simply left behind as the wider galaxy moved forward without them. I wondered, during that long flight home, if that would be humanity's fate as well. A species that reached for the stars, only to be turned away and forgotten. But something else stayed with me as well, something I could not quite name until much later. It was the way Laura had looked at that ring of worlds before we left, not with despair, not even with anger, not really, with something closer to determination, the kind of look I had seen on the faces of engineers, staring down an impossible problem, right before they found a way to solve it. When we finally returned to Earth, the news of our rejection spread quickly. I remember watching the reactions unfold across every screen, every channel, every corner of a planet that had spent generations dreaming of the day we would finally join the wider community of the stars. There was anger, there was grief. There was a kind of quiet humiliation that settled over entire cities, the sense that no matter what we built, no matter what we achieved, we would always be judged by our past rather than our potential. I remember standing in a crowded transit station on my way home, watching strangers argue about what the rejection meant for humanity's future. Some believed we should try again, softer this time, more apologetic, hoping to prove ourselves worthy in another decade. Others believed we should give up entirely, turn inward, abandon the dream of reaching the stars as equals among other civilizations. It was Laura who spoke publicly first, only a few days after our return. I watched her address gathered leaders from every major nation on Earth, standing before cameras that would carry her words to every corner of the planet. She did not offer comfort, she did not offer apology, she simply repeated what she had told me on the shuttle, the words that would soon become something far larger than any of us understood at the time. She said that 12,000 worlds had looked at humanity and found us wanting. She said we could spend the next century trying to convince them otherwise, softening ourselves, apologizing for a history none of us could change. Or we could accept who we were, take the lessons from that rejection, and build something no vote could ever deny us. I did not know, standing in that crowded station listening to her voice through a public screen, that those words would mark the beginning of an era historians would later call the Long Winter. I did not know how much humanity would sacrifice in the years that followed, how many lifetimes would be spent building something the rest of the galaxy could not yet imagine. All I knew, in that moment, was that something had shifted. The humiliation of that hole, the silver-scaled judge, the endless questions about our past, all of it had planted a seed inside every person who had watched that broadcast, a seed of quiet, burning resolve. We had been told, in the clearest terms possible, that we did not belong among the stars. So we decided to make a place among them anyway. 3 years after the rejection, I stood in a cold hangar in northern Canada, watching engineers argue over a single beam of metal that refused to hold its shape under stress testing. It seems like a small memory now, but at the time it felt like the whole future of our species rested on whether that beam would crack or hold. This was the beginning of what people later called the Long Winter, though nobody used that name yet. To us, it simply felt like work, endless, exhausting, necessary work. After Laura's speech, something changed across the entire planet. Nations that had spent decades arguing over borders and resources suddenly found themselves united by a single, simple humiliation. We had been judged and found lacking by every other civilization we had ever met. For the first time in human history, that shared shame became a kind of glue, holding together alliances that had never held for long before. I was reassigned within months of returning from the Concord Assembly. My background in structural engineering, once a small part of a much larger delegation, suddenly mattered a great deal. I was placed on a team tasked with something the public would not learn about for years. We were building the foundation of a program that would consume the next generation of human effort, resources, and sacrifice. The official name was the Ulysses Initiative, though almost nobody called it that in the early years. Most of us just called it the program, spoken with a kind of quiet weight that made clear exactly what we meant. The first challenge was resources. Humanity had ships capable of reaching nearby systems, but nothing close to what would be needed for what Laura and the other leaders envisioned. We needed materials that did not yet exist in usable quantities. We needed reactors capable of powering something far larger than anything we had built before. We needed a workforce trained in disciplines that, in some cases, had to be invented from scratch. I remember the first time I saw the full scope of the plan, laid out across a wall of screens in a briefing room buried 300 meters below the Canadian tundra. Entire industries would need to be restructured. Entire generations would need to dedicate their careers to projects they would never see completed. It was the kind of ambition that should have collapsed under its own weight within the first year. It did not collapse, because something in the human spirit responded to that shared humiliation in a way none of the Concord's judges could have predicted. I think about my own family during those early years. My sister, Emma, worked in one of the new material science institutes, built specifically to develop alloys strong enough for interstellar construction. She used to tell me over dinner about failures that would have ended most careers elsewhere, entire batches of experimental material crumbling under pressure tests, months of work lost in an instant. But she never once talked about quitting. None of them did. There was a phrase that spread quietly through every lab, every shipyard, every training facility during those years. People would say it to each other after a failure, after a setback, after another long shift that stretched into the early hours of the morning. They would say, quietly, that we were not building this for ourselves, we were building it for whoever came after us. That mindset shaped everything about the long winter. Entire careers were spent on single components of a larger design. Engineers who began working on reactor housings in their 20s would sometimes retire before the reactors themselves were ever built, passing their notes and their lessons to the next generation of engineers who would take up the same work. I remember a woman named Elena Voss, one of the lead scientists on the program, standing before a room of exhausted engineers during the 5th year of construction, when morale had reached its lowest point. Half our test reactors had failed. A promising alloy had turned out to be structurally unstable at the temperatures we needed. Funding disputes back on Earth threatened to slow the entire project. Elena did not offer empty encouragement. She stood before us and reminded us of the silver-scaled judge, of the hole filled with 12,000 worlds, of the word that had been spoken so easily, so certain of its own finality. Rejected. She said that word would follow humanity for as long as we let it define us, or we could turn it into fuel. I remember the room after she finished speaking. Nobody cheered. Nobody clapped. We simply went back to work, because that was what needed to happen next. The sacrifices during those years were not the kind people often imagine when they think of great human projects. There were no grand battles, no dramatic confrontations. The sacrifices were quieter than that, and in some ways harder to bear. Families were separated for years at a time as engineers and scientists were assigned to remote facilities built specifically for the program. Entire cities grew up around shipyards that did not yet have ships to build, populated by people who had chosen to dedicate their lives to a project most of them would never see finished. I spent 4 years at a facility built into the side of a mountain range in what used to be called the Andes, working on reactor containment systems with a team of engineers from a dozen different countries. We rarely left the facility. Communication with our families was limited to short messages sent once a week, carefully rationed to preserve bandwidth for the program's own communication needs. I remember the first time I saw my sister again after 2 years apart. She had changed in ways I had not expected, quieter, more focused, carrying herself with the calm certainty of someone who had accepted the scale of what she was working toward. She told me about breakthroughs in material science that would have seemed impossible only a few years earlier. Alloys strong enough to withstand pressures that would have crushed anything humanity had built before the rejection. The Concorde, meanwhile, seemed to forget about us almost entirely. Word occasionally reached Earth through the few diplomatic channels that remained open, small updates on Concorde politics, distant conflicts between member worlds, the slow business of a civilization that had judged us unworthy and moved on without a second thought. I do not think any of them imagined what was happening on the small, rejected world they had left behind. There were setbacks that nearly ended the program entirely. In the 7th year, an accident at one of the early shipyards claimed the lives of 11 engineers during a reactor test that went wrong. I remember the funeral, held in a quiet ceremony broadcast to every facility working on the program. Families and colleagues gathered to honor people who had given everything to a project the rest of the galaxy did not even know existed. I remember Laura, older now, her hair beginning to gray, standing before the gathered mourners and reminding us of why we continued. She said that every life given to this program was a life given in service of something larger than any single person, larger even than any single generation. She said the 11 engineers we mourned that day had understood the stakes better than anyone, and that their sacrifice would not be forgotten in the completed work that followed. It was during that same year that the first breakthrough in propulsion technology occurred, developed by a team working under a physicist named Owen Blake. His design, built on principles that had existed only in theory before the program began, promised to solve one of the greatest challenges facing our ambitions. It would take another decade to fully develop, but the breakthrough itself became a turning point, proof that the sacrifices being made were producing real results. I think about the strange rhythm of those years, the way time seemed to stretch and compress at once. Individual days felt endless, filled with the grinding difficulty of solving problems nobody had ever solved before. But the years themselves seemed to pass quickly, one blending into the next, marked only by the steady progress of a project too large for any single mind to fully comprehend. By the 10th year of the program, entire industries on Earth had reorganized themselves around its needs. Universities offered degrees in disciplines that had not existed a decade earlier. Children grew up hearing about the program the way earlier generations had heard about the moon landing, a distant, almost mythical undertaking that shaped the world around them without most of them ever seeing its results directly. I remember a conversation with Marcus Webb, still working alongside me after all those years, during a rare moment of rest at our mountain facility. He asked me if I ever regretted the path we had chosen, the years spent away from ordinary life, working toward a goal that might not be completed within our own lifetimes. I told him the truth. I did not regret it. Every difficulty, every setback, every year spent buried in a facility far from the world I had once known, felt worthwhile when I thought about the alternative. I thought about the silver-scaled judge, about the word rejected, about the quiet certainty in her voice as she delivered that verdict to a hall of 12,000 worlds. I did not want my life to be defined by that verdict. And so we continued, generation after generation, sacrifice after sacrifice, building towards something the galaxy could not yet imagine. By the time the long winter began to draw to a close, nearly 30 years had passed since our rejection. An entire generation had been born, raised, and trained specifically for the work that remained. Facilities that had once seemed impossibly ambitious now hummed with quiet efficiency, decades of accumulated knowledge finally converging toward a single, unified purpose. I remember standing at the edge of the largest shipyard ever built by human hands, watching the skeleton of something vast take shape against the darkness of orbit. It was not yet complete. It would not be complete for several more years. But even in its unfinished state, it was clear that we had built something no one in that assembly hall could have imagined. We had spent 30 years turning a single word of rejection into the foundation of something entirely new, and we were not finished yet. I was 42 years old the day I first walked the completed length of the ship we had spent my entire career building. My footsteps echoed through corridors that stretched further than any structure humanity had ever placed in orbit, and even after decades of reading schematics, seeing the ship in its finished form left me speechless. We called it the Ulysses. The name had been chosen years earlier by a committee that wanted something that captured the spirit of a long journey home, though by the time construction finished, most of us simply called her the ship, spoken with the kind of reverence usually reserved for something sacred. The Ulysses was not built the way other civilizations built their vessels. I had studied the designs of Concorde ships during our brief time among the stars, sleek vessels built around a single, elegant principle, refined over centuries of gradual improvement. Our approach was different. We did not have centuries. We had 30 years and a burning need to prove something to ourselves as much as to anyone else. Instead of a single elegant design, the Ulysses was built around a philosophy Owen Blake called adaptive engineering. Rather than committing to one perfect solution, the ship was designed with the assumption that whatever problems we encountered among the stars, we could solve through creativity and rapid adaptation rather than pre-existing perfection. Every system on board could be reconfigured, rebuilt, or repurposed depending on the situation. Every piece of the ship was designed to be more than one thing. I remember explaining this philosophy to a visiting group of young engineers who had joined the program only in its final years, too young to remember the long winter's hardest days. One of them asked why we had not simply copied the more refined designs used by Concorde vessels, since those designs had proven themselves over centuries of use. I told her the truth. We had tried, in the early years, to study and adapt existing Concorde technology wherever we could access it through diplomatic channels. But every attempt revealed the same limitation. Concorde ships were built by civilizations that had never needed to solve problems quickly, under pressure, with limited resources, and no guarantee of support from anyone else. Their ships were refined, but they were not resilient in the way our situation demanded. Humanity had spent its entire history solving problems without perfect resources, without centuries of preparation, without guaranteed support. That history, the very history the Concord judges had used against us, had shaped an engineering philosophy no other civilization could easily replicate. We built the Ulysses to reflect exactly that. The ship itself stretched nearly 4 kilometers from bow to stern, though its true scale was difficult to appreciate from any single vantage point. At its heart sat a reactor core built on the principles Owen Blake had first developed decades earlier, refined over years of testing, into something capable of powering systems far beyond anything the original designs had promised. I spent the final 2 years before completion working directly under Elena Foss, now leading the entire propulsion and reactor integration team. She had grown into one of the most respected engineers in the entire program, though she never lost the quiet, direct manner that had first inspired me all those years earlier in that mountain facility. I remember a night, only months before the Ulysses was scheduled for her first test flight, when Elena gathered our team in the observation deck overlooking the ship's nearly completed hull. She told us that we were standing at the edge of something historians would study for centuries, whether the ship succeeded or failed in its first flight. She reminded us of the 12,000 worlds that had rejected humanity and asked us to consider what those worlds would think if they could see what we had built in the decades since. Not out of arrogance, she said, but out of quiet, earned confidence. We had taken their rejection and turned it into 30 years of relentless, disciplined effort, and the result stood before us, waiting to prove itself among the stars. The first test flight of the Ulysses took place in the outer edges of our solar system, far enough from Earth that any failure would not threaten the world we had built her to protect. I was present in the command center during that flight, monitoring reactor output alongside Elena and a small team of engineers who had spent years preparing for this single moment. I remember the tension in that room as the ship's engines engaged for the first time, a low vibration passing through the command center that seemed to resonate in my chest rather than my ears. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. We simply watched the readouts, waiting for any sign of failure, any indication that 30 years of work had been built on a flaw we had somehow missed. The Ulysses held steady. Her reactor output climbed smoothly to levels we had only simulated before that day. Her hull, built from alloys developed specifically for this purpose, showed no signs of stress, even as she pushed beyond the velocities any human vessel had previously achieved. I remember Elena closing her eyes for a moment, her hands pressed flat against the console in front of her, as the ship completed her first full test maneuver without a single system failure. When she opened her eyes again, she looked at me and simply said that we had done it. 30 years, and we had finally done it. The months following that first test flight were filled with further trials, each one pushing the Ulysses further than the last. We tested her propulsion systems across increasingly demanding conditions. We tested her defensive capabilities, developed through decades of careful research into energy shielding and structural resilience. We tested every system aboard the ship, determined to understand her full capabilities before she was ever called upon to use them. I remember a conversation with Laura during this period, now serving as one of the senior leaders overseeing the entire program, her hair fully gray after decades spent guiding humanity through the long winter. She asked me, during a quiet moment in one of the observation lounges overlooking the ship, whether I believed the Ulysses could accomplish what we had built her for. I told her I did not know exactly what challenges awaited us among the stars. None of us did. But I told her that after 30 years spent solving problems no other civilization had ever needed to face, I believed humanity had built something capable of adapting to whatever those challenges turned out to be. Laura told me something that day I have never forgotten. She said the Concorde had judged humanity based on our past, on the mistakes and conflicts that had shaped our early history. But the Ulysses was not built from our past. She was built from everything we had learned since that rejection, everything we had become in the decades since 12,000 worlds turned us away. The final months before the Ulysses departed on her first true mission were spent training her crew, a carefully selected group of engineers, scientists, and officers drawn from every corner of Earth. I was among those selected to serve as chief structural engineer, a role that placed me directly on the bridge alongside the ship's senior officers. Our commanding officer was a woman named Captain Naomi Voss, no relation to Elena, though the coincidence of shared names became something of a quiet joke among the crew during training. Naomi had served in Earth's exploratory fleet for over a decade before being selected to command the Ulysses, chosen specifically for her ability to remain calm under pressure and her willingness to consider unconventional solutions when standard approaches failed. I remember our final briefing before departure, held in the ship's main command center with the entire senior crew gathered around a holographic display of known space. Naomi reminded us of everything that had brought us to this moment, the rejection that had started it all, the 30 years of sacrifice that had followed, and the ship now waiting to carry us beyond anything humanity had previously attempted. She told us that we were not simply testing a ship that day. We were testing everything humanity had become since our rejection, everything we had built in response to being told we did not belong among the stars. I remember looking around that command center at the faces of people who had, in one way or another, dedicated their entire lives to this moment. Elena, who had spent decades perfecting the reactor systems now humming quietly beneath our feet. Marcus, still working alongside me after all those years, now serving as our lead systems officer. Dozens of others whose names I had come to know over years of shared sacrifice, each of them carrying their own quiet piece of the 30 years that had brought us here. We had spent a generation building the Ulysses in isolation, without the guidance or approval of the wider galactic community that had once rejected us. We had built her not from centuries of refined tradition, but from 30 years of urgent, focused necessity, shaped by a determination that no other civilization we had encountered seemed to possess in quite the same way. As I stood on that bridge, watching the final preparations unfold around me, I felt something I had not fully allowed myself to feel since that day in the Concord Assembly Hall so many years earlier. I felt ready, not ready to prove ourselves to 12,000 worlds who had already made their judgment, ready simply to see what we had built and what it could do when finally given the chance to matter. The signal reached us on a quiet shift, 3 months into the Ulysses's first extended patrol beyond human territory. I was reviewing structural reports in the small office adjoining the main command center when the alert sounded, a sharp tone that immediately pulled every officer on duty to their stations. Marcus was the one who first decoded the transmission. I watched his expression change as the translation software finished its work, his usual calm replaced by something tighter, more urgent. He called Captain Naomi to the command center before he even finished reading the full message. The signal was a distress call, broadcast on a frequency used by Concord vessels for emergency communication. It had been sent from a system nearly 2 days away at our current speed, a system belonging to a small Concord member world called Ithera. The message was fragmented, damaged by whatever had interfered with its transmission, but the core of it was clear enough. Ithera was under attack, and whoever was attacking them was not responding to any of the usual diplomatic or defensive protocols the Concord relied upon. I remember standing near the back of the command center as Naomi read through the decoded transmission, her expression unreadable as she absorbed the details. Ithara's distress call mentioned something the translation software struggled to fully interpret, a threat their own records did not recognize, something that had ignored every attempt at communication or negotiation. Elena arrived shortly after, having been called from the reactor control room once word of the signal spread through the ship. She stood beside Naomi, both women studying the fragmented transmission with the same careful intensity I had seen from them during the most difficult years of construction. The debate that followed lasted nearly 6 hours, conducted in the ship's main conference room with every senior officer present. I sat near the end of the table, listening as arguments unfolded on both sides of a question that, 30 years earlier, would have seemed impossible for humanity to even consider answering. Marcus spoke first, raising the obvious point that Ithara was one of the 12,000 worlds that had voted against our admission to the Concord. He did not say it with bitterness, simply as a fact worth acknowledging before we decided anything. He asked whether humanity owed anything to a civilization that had judged us unworthy of even basic membership among the stars. Naomi listened carefully before responding. She reminded the room that the vote against humanity had been a decision made by an assembly, not necessarily a reflection of every individual life within the Concord's member worlds. Somewhere on Ithara, she said, there were people, families, communities who had never personally judged humanity at all, people who were now facing something their own defenses could not handle. Elena added something I had not considered until she spoke it aloud. She pointed out that the very qualities the Concord had used to reject us, our history of conflict, our adaptability born from struggle, were exactly the qualities that might allow us to help Ithara now, when their own more refined, more comfortable civilization could not. I found myself thinking about the silver-scaled judge again, her calm voice delivering our rejection to that hall of 12,000 worlds. I thought about the delegate who had questioned our violent history, as if growth and change meant nothing once a mistake had been made. If we turned away now, ignoring a distress call simply because it came from a world that had rejected us, would we not be proving exactly what they had always feared? That humanity acted only from grievance, only from anger, never from the deeper resolve we had spent 30 years building into everything we created. I raised my hand and spoke for the first time in that meeting. I told the room that we had not spent a generation building the Ulysses simply to prove a point to 12,000 worlds who had already made up their minds about us. We had built her to become something better than the judgment placed upon us, and becoming something better meant choosing to help, even when help was not required of us, even when the world asking for aid had once turned us away without a second thought. The room fell quiet after I finished speaking. Naomi looked around the table, studying each face carefully before she spoke again. She said that the decision ultimately rested with her as commanding officer, but she wanted every voice in that room heard before she made her final call. One by one, the officers around that table shared their thoughts. Some worried about the risk, about engaging an unknown threat with a ship that had never before been tested in true conflict. Others worried about diplomatic consequences, about how the Concord might react to human intervention in a crisis their own worlds could not resolve. But beneath every concern raised that day, I sensed the same quiet determination that had carried humanity through 30 years of sacrifice. We had not built the Ulysses to remain idle, while others suffered, regardless of what those others had once decided about us. Naomi made her decision before the meeting ended. She stood, faced the room, and told us that the Ulysses would divert course toward Ithara immediately. She reminded us that we were not simply answering a distress call. We were making a choice about who humanity intended to become among the stars, a choice that would echo far beyond whatever we found waiting for us at Ithara. I remember returning to my station afterward, running final structural checks on the ship's defensive systems, while Elena's team began preparing the reactor for the increased output our journey would require. The mood throughout the ship shifted noticeably in the hours that followed, a nervous energy replacing the routine calm of our earlier patrol. During the journey toward Ithara, more fragments of information reached us through the damage distress signal, pieced together slowly by our communications team. The threat attacking Ithara did not match any recorded profile in the Concord's extensive databases we had gained limited access to during brief diplomatic exchanges after our rejection. Whatever was attacking that world moved with a coordination and aggression the Concord's own defensive forces had never successfully countered. I spent much of that 2-day journey reviewing every scrap of information we managed to gather, trying to understand what we might be facing when we arrived. Elena worked alongside me for several of those hours, her focus entirely on ensuring the Ulysses' systems would perform at their absolute limits if called upon. I remember a quiet conversation with her during one of the final hours before our arrival, both of us taking a brief pause from our preparations. She asked me if I feared what we might find at Ithara. I told her the truth. I feared many things: the unknown threat, the possibility that our 30 years of preparation might not be enough, the weight of representing humanity's first true action among the stars since our rejection. But I told her I feared something else more deeply. I feared that if we did not go, if we allowed fear or old grievances to stop us from answering that distress call, we would prove every doubt the Concord judges had ever held about humanity. We would prove that we acted only from wounded pride, never from the deeper resolve that had truly carried us through the long winter. Elena nodded slowly at that, and told me she felt the same. She said that somewhere along the 30 years of sacrifice behind us, the goal had quietly shifted for many of the people who built the Ulysses. It was no longer simply about proving ourselves worthy to 12,000 worlds that had already judged us. It had become about becoming the kind of civilization we ourselves could be proud of, regardless of whether the rest of the galaxy ever recognized it. As we approached the final hours of our journey, Naomi called the senior crew together one last time before arrival. She reminded us that whatever we found at Ithara, we would face it not as a species seeking approval, but as a civilization that had already decided who it intended to become. I remember the quiet tension in the command center as the Ulysses approached the edge of the Ithara system, sensors sweeping ahead of us for any sign of the threat described in that fragmented distress call. Every officer on the bridge understood, in that moment, that we were about to answer a question no vote in any assembly hall could ever settle for us. Not what 12,000 worlds believed humanity to be, but what we had chosen, through 30 years of sacrifice, to become. The ship's sensors flared with new data as we crossed into the system's outer boundary, and I felt every muscle in my body tighten as the first readings came through. Whatever was happening at Ithra, we were only minutes away from seeing it with our own eyes. The Ulysses dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of Ithra's home system, and for a moment, the command center fell completely silent as the full scale of what awaited us appeared on every display. Ithara's defensive fleet, what remained of it, was scattered across the space between the planet and its outer moons, dozens of vessels either disabled or destroyed entirely. Beyond them, closer to the planet itself, dark shapes moved with a coordination that reminded me of something predatory rather than mechanical, vessels unlike anything catalogued in even the limited Concord records we had studied. I remember Naomi's voice, calm despite the chaos displayed before us, ordering our sensor teams to identify the attacking force as quickly as possible. Elena's team, monitoring reactor output from the systems bay, confirmed that the Ulysses could sustain full combat readiness for an extended engagement if necessary. The attacking vessels showed no recognition of standard Concord communication channels. Our own attempts to hail them, following protocols we had prepared during the journey, were met with nothing but silence, followed by an immediate and aggressive shift in their formation as they detected our arrival. I watched from my station as the first wave of those vessels turned toward the Ulysses, abandoning their assault on the remaining Ithara defenders to focus entirely on the new, unfamiliar presence that had just entered their system. Whatever intelligence guided those ships, it recognized immediately that we represented something different from anything they had previously encountered. Naomi ordered defensive positioning as the enemy vessels closed the distance, her voice steady even as the tension in the command center grew thick enough to feel. I remember gripping the edge of my station console, watching the tactical display update in real time as dozens of enemy signatures adjusted their approach toward us. The first exchange happened faster than I expected. Energy discharge from the lead enemy vessels struck the Ulysses's forward shields, and I felt the entire ship shudder from the impact, a vibration that traveled through the deck plating beneath my feet. Elena's voice came through the comm system almost immediately, confirming that shield integrity remained stable despite the force of the strike. I remember glancing toward the tactical display as our own defensive systems engaged for the first time in true combat conditions. The Ulysses's weapon systems, developed over decades of careful research, responded with a precision that surprised even those of us who had spent years designing them. Rather than simply returning fire in a straightforward exchange, our systems adapted in real time, analyzing the attacking vessel's formation and adjusting our response accordingly. Naomi called out instructions calmly, directing our ship's movements with the same steady confidence she had shown throughout her years commanding smaller vessels in Earth's exploratory fleet. I watched her study the tactical display with intense focus, searching for patterns in the enemy's aggressive but strangely uncoordinated attacks. It became clear within the first several minutes of engagement that whatever force we faced relied primarily on overwhelming numbers and relentless aggression rather than sophisticated strategy. Their vessels struck repeatedly at the same points along our shields, seemingly unable to adjust their tactics even as our defensive systems adapted to counter each new wave of attacks. I remember Marcus's voice cutting through the tension in the command center, reporting that our shields were holding well beyond the parameters we had originally projected during testing. Elena's team, working furiously in the reactor control room, confirmed that power output remained stable even as we pushed our systems toward their functional limits. The remaining Ithara defensive vessels, badly damaged from their earlier engagement, began to regroup as they recognized the shift in the attacking force's attention. I watched on the tactical display as several of their surviving ships repositioned themselves near the Ulysses, clearly recognizing an unexpected ally in the unfamiliar vessel that had just arrived in their system. I remember a moment during that engagement when I looked up from my structural monitoring station and saw, through the reinforced viewport at the edge of the command center, the shape of the Ulysses reflected briefly in the hull of a nearby Ithara vessel. Even in the chaos of that engagement, I felt a strange, quiet pride at the sight of our ship, built from 30 years of sacrifice, standing firm against a threat the Concorde's own defenders had been unable to counter. Naomi ordered a change in our formation nearly 20 minutes into the engagement, directing the Ulysses toward the heart of the attacking force, rather than simply defending our position at the edge of the system. I understood immediately what she intended. Rather than allowing the enemy to dictate the terms of engagement, she wanted to force them to react to us. Elena's team responded instantly to the shift in strategy, redirecting power throughout the ship's systems to support the more aggressive maneuver Naomi had ordered. I remember the entire ship shifting beneath my feet as the Ulysses accelerated toward the center of the attacking formation, weapon systems fully engaged as we closed the distance. The enemy vessels, still relying on the same relentless but simple tactics they had shown throughout the engagement, struggled to adjust to our sudden shift in strategy. I watched several of their ships collide with each other in their haste to reposition, their coordination breaking down entirely as the Ulysses pushed directly into the heart of their formation. I remember the tactical display flashing with new information as our sensors picked up something unexpected. A central vessel among the attacking force that appeared to be coordinating the others, larger and more heavily armored than the rest. Naomi's expression shifted the moment she saw the same data, and she immediately redirected our focus toward that central vessel. The remaining Ithara defenders, watching the shift in our strategy, began coordinating their own attacks around our movements, following the lead the Ulysses had established without any need for direct communication. I remember feeling a strange sense of unity in that moment, humanity and a civilization that had once rejected us, working together against a threat neither of us fully understood. Elena's voice came through the comm system again, warning that our reactor output was approaching levels we had only tested in simulation, never in true combat conditions. Naomi acknowledged the warning, but did not order a reduction in power, her focus entirely on the central enemy vessel, now clearly visible on our tactical display, its heavier armor plating suggesting a level of importance the rest of the attacking force clearly did not share. I remember watching the Ulysses close the final distance toward that central vessel, weapon systems fully charged, our shields still holding despite the sustained assault we had weathered throughout the engagement. The moment felt strangely quiet despite the chaos surrounding us, as if the entire battle had been building toward this single, decisive confrontation. The central enemy vessel turned to face us directly, and for the first time since the engagement began, I felt a flicker of genuine uncertainty pass through the command center. Whatever intelligence guided that ship, it recognized the threat the Ulysses now posed, and its sudden, focused attention toward us carried a weight the earlier scattered attacks had lacked entirely. Naomi's voice remained steady as she ordered our weapon systems to full power, the Ulysses closing the final distance toward a confrontation that would determine not only the outcome of this engagement, but perhaps something far larger about what humanity had truly built during those 30 years of quiet, determined sacrifice. The central enemy vessel unleashed a coordinated strike unlike anything we had faced so far in the engagement, and I felt the entire ship groan under the force of the impact as our shields absorbed the brunt of the attack. Elena's voice came through the comm system immediately, her tone sharper now, reporting that shield integrity had dropped to levels that demanded our full attention. Naomi did not hesitate. She ordered an immediate adjustment to our approach, directing the Ulysses into a tight rotation that brought our secondary weapon batteries into play for the first time since the engagement began. I remember watching the tactical display shift as our ship responded with a fluidity that no straightforward vessel design could have matched, every system adapting in real time to counter the threat before us. This was the moment the 30 years of adaptive engineering truly proved its worth. Rather than committing to a single tactic and hoping it held, the Ulysses shifted constantly, drawing on reserves of power and structural flexibility that had been built into her very design from the earliest days of the program. I thought, in the middle of that chaos, of Owen Blake's original philosophy, the idea that we did not need one perfect solution, only the ability to solve whatever problem stood in front of us in that moment. The central enemy vessel adjusted its own tactics in response, clearly recognizing that its earlier strategy had failed to account for a ship capable of such rapid change. I watched as it attempted to break away from the engagement, retreating toward the deeper cover of its remaining scattered forces, perhaps hoping to regroup and overwhelm us through simple numbers once again. Naomi refused to allow that retreat. She ordered the Ulysses to pursue, our engines pushing beyond their tested limits as Elena's team fed every available reserve of power into propulsion. I remember the deep vibration running through the deck plating as the ship surged forward, closing the distance the enemy vessel had tried to create. The remaining Ithara defenders, watching our pursuit, moved to cut off the enemy's other escape routes, coordinating with a precision that suggested they had quickly come to trust the strategy the Ulysses had established throughout the engagement. I remember feeling a strange sense of quiet awe at that moment, watching two civilizations that had never fought alongside each other before, falling into a rhythm of cooperation neither of us had planned in advance. Cornered, the central enemy vessel turned to make one final, desperate stand, unleashing everything it had left toward the Ulysses in what I understood, even in that moment, to be a final attempt to break through our defenses before its own systems failed entirely. I remember gripping my station console as the ship shuddered under the force of that final assault, alarms sounding throughout the command center as several secondary systems flickered under the strain. Elena's voice came through the comm system, steady despite the obvious tension underlying it, confirming that our shields had held, barely, but held nonetheless. Naomi ordered our own weapon systems to respond in full, and I watched on the tactical display as the Ulysses's coordinated strike finally overwhelmed the central vessel's failing defenses. The enemy formation collapsed almost immediately after their central vessel went silent, scattered ships breaking away in what appeared to be an automated retreat rather than any conscious decision. Whatever intelligence had guided that coordinated assault, it seemed entirely dependent on the central vessel we had just disabled, the remaining ships reduced to simple, uncoordinated movement without their guiding presence. I remember the command center falling into a strange, exhausted silence as the last of the enemy vessels retreated beyond our sensor range, the engagement finally coming to an end after what had felt like hours but had, according to the ship's own logs, lasted less than 40 minutes. Naomi allowed herself a brief moment of visible relief before turning her attention to the aftermath surrounding us. She ordered immediate assistance for the surviving Ithara vessels, several of them badly damaged and drifting without power near the edge of the system. I remember watching our own damage control teams mobilize instantly, years of training finally put to use in exactly the situation they had been designed for. It took several hours to fully stabilize the situation at Ithara, coordinating repair efforts between our own crew and the surviving members of the planet's defensive fleet. I spent much of that time working directly with Elena's engineering teams, helping restore power to several of the damaged Ithara vessels using techniques we had spent years developing during the long winter. I remember one particular exchange during those recovery efforts, working alongside an Ithara engineer named Kyle, who approached our repair team with visible hesitation at first, clearly uncertain how to interact with the very species his own world had voted against admitting to the Concord only decades earlier. I remember the careful, almost cautious way he thanked us for our assistance, as if unsure whether gratitude was even the appropriate response, given the history between our peoples. I told him simply that we had not come to Ithara seeking anything from his people. We had come because a distress call had reached us, and because the crew of the Ulysses had decided that the past did not need to dictate every choice we made about the future. Kale studied me for a long moment before nodding slowly, and I saw something shift in his expression, a recognition that perhaps did not erase the history between our peoples, but at least allowed room for something new to begin. Word of the engagement spread quickly through Concord communication channels in the days that followed, carried first by the surviving Ithara officials who had witnessed the battle directly, and later confirmed by observers from neighboring systems who had detected the engagement through long-range sensors. I remember Naomi receiving the first formal communication from Concord officials only 2 days after the battle ended, a message far different in tone from anything humanity had received since our rejection 30 years earlier. The message came from a senior Concord representative, requesting information about the vessel that had intervened at Ithara, and about the civilization responsible for its construction. I remember the careful, almost disbelieving tone that our translation systems captured even through the formal diplomatic language used in the message, a tone that suggested the Concord itself was still struggling to understand exactly what had happened at the edge of their territory. Naomi gathered the senior crew together once the message had been fully reviewed, and I remember the quiet satisfaction on her face as she read through the details with us one final time before drafting our response. She reminded us that 30 years earlier, a hall of 12,000 worlds had judged humanity unworthy of even basic membership among the stars. Now, that same Concord found itself asking who we were, seeking to understand a civilization they had once dismissed without a second thought. I remember feeling something shift within me as Naomi spoke those words, a quiet recognition that the engagement at Ithara had changed something far larger than the fate of a single besieged world. We had not simply defended a planet that had once voted against us. We had shown an entire galaxy, watching now through frightened, curious eyes, exactly what humanity had built during the years they had spent ignoring us entirely. The threat that had attacked Ithara remained, for the moment, an unsolved mystery, its origin and true nature still unknown, even after the engagement's conclusion. But as I stood in the command center of the Ulysses, watching Naomi draft our first formal response to a Concord that had rejected us decades earlier, I understood that whatever came next, humanity would face it not as a civilization seeking approval, but as one that had already proven, through 30 years of quiet sacrifice and a single decisive battle, exactly what we were capable of becoming. 6 weeks after the engagement at Ithara, I stood on the observation deck of the Ulysses, watching a small formation of Concord vessels approach us with a caution that felt entirely different from the confident, dismissive energy I remembered from that assembly hall 30 years earlier. The delegation requesting this meeting represented a very different tone than the one we had encountered during our original rejection. Rather than summoning us to their grand assembly hall to stand before 12,000 judging worlds, the Concord had requested, quite carefully, permission to send a small group of representatives directly to the Ulysses. Naomi had granted the request, though she made clear through every level of our communication that this meeting would take place on our terms, aboard our ship, on our schedule. I remember watching from the observation deck as their shuttle approached, smaller and less impressive than I expected given the weight the Concord had once carried in my mind. Perhaps it simply seemed smaller now, measured against everything humanity had built in the decades since our rejection. The delegation that stepped aboard the Ulysses included several familiar faces from that original assembly, though age and circumstance had changed them as much as 30 years had changed me. I recognized, among them, a representative from Ostren, one of the worlds whose delegate had questioned our violent history so pointedly during that original hearing. He looked older now, more cautious, studying the corridors of the Ulysses with an expression that mixed curiosity with something close to quiet unease. Naomi received the delegation personally in the ship's main conference room, the same room where our senior crew had debated whether to answer Ithara's distress call only weeks earlier. I stood near the back of the room during that meeting, watching as the Concord representatives struggled to find the right words for a conversation none of them had ever expected to have. The Ostrena representative spoke first, offering something that sounded, even through the careful formality of diplomatic translation, remarkably close to an apology. He acknowledged the assistance humanity had provided at Ithara, assistance that had arrived when the Concorde's own defensive forces had proven insufficient against a threat still not fully understood, even after weeks of investigation. Naomi listened patiently before responding, her tone measured but firm. She reminded the delegation that 30 years earlier, their assembly had judged humanity unworthy of even basic membership among the stars, citing our history of conflict as proof that we could not be trusted among a wider community of civilizations. She asked, quite directly, what had changed in their assessment since that day. The silence that followed stretched long enough that I found myself holding my breath, waiting to see how the delegation would respond to a question that carried the full weight of 30 years of rejection behind it. It was another representative, a quiet delegate from a world called Threll that I had not recognized among the original assembly, who finally answered. She said that the Concorde had judged humanity based on our past, believing that history alone was sufficient to predict our future behavior among the stars. What we had shown at Ithara, and in the decades of quiet development that had clearly preceded it, suggested that history was not as fixed a predictor as their assembly had once assumed. Civilizations, she said, carrying a careful weight in her translated words, could grow beyond the mistakes of their past, in ways her own people had perhaps failed to properly consider. I remember the quiet pride I felt hearing those words, though I understood immediately that pride alone was not enough to define humanity's response to this moment. Naomi seemed to understand the same thing, because her next words carried a tone I had not expected, neither triumphant nor bitter, but simply, quietly honest. She told the delegation that humanity had spent 30 years building something we needed, regardless of whether the Concorde ever recognized its value. We had built the Ulysses, and the broader capabilities she represented, not to prove ourselves worthy of their approval, but because we had decided, as a species, that we would no longer wait for permission to become who we wanted to be. The delegation exchanged uncertain glances at this response, clearly having expected either gratitude for their reconsideration or renewed anger over our original rejection, rather than the calm, unbothered honesty Naomi offered instead. I watched the Austrian representative shift in his seat before finally asking the question I suspected the entire delegation had traveled here specifically to raise. He asked whether humanity would now be willing to formally reapply for admission into the Concorde, given everything that had transpired. Naomi did not answer immediately. She looked toward Elena, toward Marcus, toward me, and the other senior officers gathered in that room, each of us carrying our own quiet piece of the 30 years that had led to this moment. When she finally spoke, her words carried the weight of every sacrifice made during the long winter, every life given to a project the rest of the galaxy had not even known existed until a single engagement at Ithara forced them to notice. She told the delegation that humanity would consider their offer, but not with the urgency they perhaps expected. We had spent 30 years building a place among the stars entirely on our own terms, and we intended to consider any future relationship with the Concorde in exactly the same spirit, deliberately, carefully, and without the desperate need for approval that had once defined our earlier attempts at diplomacy. I remember the meeting ending on that note, the Concorde delegation departing with far more uncertainty than they had arrived with, and far less control over the outcome than their original assembly had once held over humanity's fate. In the weeks that followed, word of the Ulysses and the engagement at Ithara spread throughout the wider Concorde, carried through every diplomatic and communication channel available to a civilization suddenly forced to reconsider everything it had assumed about the small, rejected species it had dismissed decades earlier. I remember reading reports of similar requests arriving from other Concorde worlds, each seeking to understand exactly what humanity had built during those 30 quiet years of isolation. I stood again on the observation deck of the Ulysses, several months later, watching the stars stretch out before us as the ship prepared for another mission, this one further from home than any human vessel had previously traveled. Elena joined me there, both of us taking a rare quiet moment away from the demands of our respective duties. She asked me if I ever thought back to that day in the assembly hall, the silver-scaled judge delivering our ejection to a room of 12,000 worlds. I told her I did, often, though the memory no longer carried the same sting it once had. It had become, instead, a reminder of exactly how far we had traveled since that day, not toward acceptance from a galaxy that had once turned us away, but toward becoming something we could be genuinely proud of, regardless of whether that acceptance ever fully arrived. Elena smiled at that, and reminded me of something Laura had said many years earlier, back when the program was still little more than an ambitious plan sketched across the walls of a briefing room, buried deep beneath the Canadian tundra. Laura had said that if the galaxy would not open its door for humanity, we would build one of our own. I looked out at the stars stretching endlessly before the Ulysses, thinking of everything that single sentence had grown into over 30 years of sacrifice, struggle, and quiet, determined effort. We had not been given a place among the 12,000 worlds that once judged us unworthy. We had built one instead, on our own terms, through our own strength, exactly as Laura had promised on that quiet shuttle ride home so many years before. The door the Concorde had once closed against us no longer mattered nearly as much as it once had. We had built our own, and we intended to keep building, further into the stars than any single vote of rejection could ever have imagined possible.